It begins not with the
Blessed art
softness
thou
of
amongst
prayer but
women,
with a
and
scream,
blessed is the
sharp
fruit
and
of thy womb,
unexpected,
Jesus.
slicing through the
Holy
stone
Mary,
corridors
Mother
of a
of God,
convent
pray
deep in the
for
wooded
us.
hills of rural
Santa
Europe.
Maria,
The building, heavy
ora
with
pro
centuries of devotion, had been
nobis.
constructed to shelter women who had given their lives to God. Its thick grey walls held hymns, whispered confessions, and the gentle footsteps of sisters crossing from cloister to chapel. Yet on this storm-soaked night in the late 19th century, those same walls reverberated with something the women had no words for, a sound that shattered the quiet order of faith. The voice was that of Sister Agnes, a young nun whose fragile frame rarely drew notice. Her days were quiet, her devotion steady, her presence unremarkable. But on this night, in the midst of evening prayers, her body shook, her rosary slipped from her hand, and her mouth released a cry that froze every sister in the pews around her. She pointed not to the shadows in the rafters, not to some spectral figure drifting among them, but to something so ordinary that its power lay in its banality, a pew. A simple wooden bench, carved by local craftsmen long ago, worn by the touch of countless worshippers. No carvings of demons scarred its surface, no stains of fire marked its wood. And yet, Agnes's voice trembled as she declared before her sisters that the pew was not empty. "He sits there," she whispered, voice cracking into sobs. "The devil has his place in this chapel. That seat belongs to him." The claim was madness, and yet it landed with the weight of dread. For although no sister had spoken of it aloud, there had long been unease about that very pew. It was rarely occupied. When novices entered the chapel for the first time, they somehow avoided it without instruction, sliding into other rows as if guided by instinct. Candles on its edge seemed to flicker more violently than elsewhere. Hymnals placed upon its wood were sometimes found on the floor by morning, as though the seat rejected holy words. Outside, the storm raged, thunder rumbling like distant drums and rain slapping against the stained glass windows. The chapel's air smelled of damp stone and melted wax. Inside, time seemed to halt. Sisters clutched their rosaries tighter, their prayers suspended, eyes darting between Agnes and the bench she accused. The abbess, a woman hardened by decades of discipline, rose from her place and ordered silence. Her command carried authority, but Agnes's trembling words did not cease. She insisted she could hear a growl when she knelt near the pew, a low vibration beneath the prayers, as though another presence joined the liturgy with its own mocking cadence. The abbess tried to restore order, but unease had already spread. Even as she scolded Agnes, even as she warned against blasphemy and delusion, many of the sisters avoided turning their eyes toward the pew. Their hearts raced, their skin prickled with cold sweat. For while they longed to dismiss the outburst as hysteria, something inside them resisted. The bench had always been strange, always avoided, always carried an aura none could fully explain. Agnes had simply given voice to what others buried in silence. The convent was a place meant to protect against darkness. Its founding, generations earlier, had been a deliberate act to bring Christian order to a land marked by older, pagan rites. The villagers had once whispered of sacrifices made in hidden groves, of spirits tied to earth and blood. Building a chapel here was meant to cleanse those superstitions. And yet, superstition clung stubbornly to the land, threading through stories, dreams, and now, it seemed, through the very wood of the pew that Agnes feared. Faith and fear wrestled in the chapel that night. Was Agnes's voice the cry of a woman collapsing under the weight of cloistered life? Or had she, in her devotion, seen something her sisters could not? The abbess chose discipline. She ordered Agnes removed, carried by two sisters back to her quarters. The others were commanded to resume prayer. And yet the sound of that scream lingered. Every syllable remained imprinted in the air long after Agnes's footsteps had faded down the corridor. The pew itself did not move. It sat silent, its surface gleaming faintly in the candlelight, as though nothing had changed. Yet nothing was the same. For now it was not simply a piece of furniture. It had become a contested ground, a symbol of intrusion, an object that blurred the line between sanctity and violation. To sit there would be to test not only one's faith but one's sanity. To avoid it would be to concede that Agnes had spoken the truth. In the days that followed, silence became the convent's strategy. The abbess forbade mention of the outburst. The sisters were told to pray harder, to fast, to bury their unease beneath obedience. But silence is never empty. It grows heavy, pressing into the mind, echoing at night. The more they avoided speaking of the pew, the more it dominated their thoughts. Shadows stretched longer across it in the candlelight. The chapel creaked strangely during vespers. And each time a sister entered, her eyes flicked, if only for a heartbeat, toward that silent seat. The story of Sister Agnes's scream did not end in a single night. It became the first crack in the convent's foundation, a fracture between faith and dread. For what she cried was simple, and impossible to forget: the devil was not outside, prowling in the forests or lurking in distant temptations. He was inside, seated comfortably among them, claiming his own place in the house of God. The pew was his, and nothing the abbess commanded could silence the echo of that belief. From that storm-drenched evening onward, the convent was no longer merely a house of prayer. It had become a stage for an unfolding struggle, between reason and madness, silence and confession, light and shadow. And at its center, unmoved, untouched, sat the pew that no one dared approach. To understand the terror that would later consume the sisters, one must first step backward into the past, into the world that gave birth to the convent itself. The chapel, with its dim corridors and icy floors, did not appear from nothing. It was the product of centuries of struggle between belief and doubt, between sacred order and the lingering shadows of older traditions that refused to die. When one looks upon its weathered stones, one does not simply see architecture. One sees the persistence of memory etched into walls, memory that cannot be erased by holy water alone. The convent stood on a rise of land just beyond the village, its silhouette rising above the surrounding woods. The villagers called the hill cursed long before the foundation was ever laid. Folklore whispered that beneath its soil had once been a place of offering, a ground where pagans lit fires, sang chants, and spilled blood in rites that honored powers older than Christianity. When missionaries first arrived, they knew well the strategy of conquest: erect a church where the old gods were once worshipped. To sanctify the land was to erase the memory. But memory has a way of persisting, of lingering beneath the surface, even when rituals are buried and songs are silenced. The convent was established in the mid-17th century, long after the first stones of the chapel were blessed. It was not built for wealth or grandeur. This was not Rome, nor even one of the proud cathedrals of France. Its purpose was far humbler, and perhaps more difficult: to tame the spiritual unrest of a region where superstition was often stronger than faith. Daughters of peasants, millers, shepherds, and farmers found themselves brought here, some willingly, others at the insistent urging of families who believed that dedicating a child to God might secure divine favor or forgiveness. For these women, the convent became both prison and refuge. Life inside was ruled by silence, prayer, and sacrifice. The day began in darkness, with bells calling the sisters to matins before dawn. Cold water from the stone basin numbed their hands as they washed. Bread was coarse, soup was thin, and meat was almost never served. Their world narrowed to the rhythm of psalms and the echo of footsteps across the cloister. For the villagers beyond the convent walls, life was dictated by seasons of planting and harvest, of hunger and plenty. But inside, the seasons meant only changes in light through narrow windows and the shifting of drafts through stone cracks. This austerity was not cruelty in their eyes. It was devotion. Every discomfort was an offering, every hunger a prayer, every silence an attempt to hear the divine. And yet, into this setting, shadows still crept. The convent was isolated, yes, but never free from the rumors that swirled among the villagers below. They whispered of strange lights upon the hill, of voices that seemed to drift down from the chapel long after the bells had ceased. Farmers crossing near the convent after dusk swore that shadows moved across its stained glass, even when no service was held. Such tales traveled, growing sharper each time they were told. For a community steeped in both piety and superstition, the convent was a paradox, holy, yet unsettling, sanctified, yet never free from fear. The pew itself, which would later stand at the center of Sister Agnes's scream, had its own history tied to these tensions. It had been commissioned by a wealthy benefactor in the 18th century, a man whose reputation was tangled in contradictions. On one hand, he was a patron of the church, donating timber, coin, and land to ensure the convent's survival during a famine. On the other hand, villagers muttered that his wealth came from dealings less than pure, that his sudden rise in fortune was the result of bargains made not with men, but with forces better left unnamed. He was buried with honor, yet his grave was avoided at night. The pew he donated was placed near the center of the chapel, where all could see it, a symbol of generosity and presence. But for the sisters who prayed daily, it became something else, an intrusion, a reminder of the complicated relationship between holiness and the darker whispers of the world beyond. The convent endured winters that seemed endless, with snow piling against its doors and frost biting through its stone. In spring, the woods surrounding it filled with life, yet inside the walls, silence pressed heavier than blossoms. Summers brought heat that made the air suffocating in the chapel, but the rules of prayer never changed. Through decades, sisters came and went, some leaving behind diaries, others vanishing into the anonymity of obedience. The rhythm of life seemed eternal, unbroken, almost outside of time. And yet, beneath the surface of order, fear never entirely left. A cough in the dormitory might be a sign of illness, or perhaps a punishment from God. A shadow cast strangely in the candlelight might be a simple accident of flame, or it might be something else. When Sister Agnes finally screamed in the 19th century, she did not invent terror. She only gave it a voice. For generations, the convent had lived with silence that masked unease, with rituals that attempted to suppress older memories, with faith that sometimes faltered under the burden of isolation. The pew was not only a piece of furniture. It was a vessel for everything unspoken, the unease of villagers, the fears of sisters, the buried past of the land itself. By the time Agnes's voice shattered the silence, the ground had already been prepared for such a moment. A convent is often imagined as a place outside history, where the world does not intrude. But in truth, it is never apart. It carries the burdens of the land where it is built, the memories of those who passed through, and the silence of things never confessed. This convent, perched above its weary village, was no different. It was a house of prayer, yes, but also a house of shadows. And once the Devil's Pew was named aloud, the weight of all those centuries seemed to shift, pressing down upon the sisters with a force they could no longer deny. Long before Sister Agnes raised her trembling voice against the presence she believed sat in the chapel, the convent had already known subtle disturbances, faint signs that something was not entirely right. These were not the thunderclaps of obvious horror, nor the grand spectacles of legend. They were whispers, shadows, and silences that accumulated like dust, settling into the hearts of the sisters until the weight became unbearable. To those outside the walls, life at the convent may have seemed serene, orderly, untroubled. But to the women within, there existed a current beneath their prayers, a tension that neither discipline nor devotion could dispel. The pew stood at the center of this quiet unease. On the surface, it was nothing remarkable, its wood polished with use, its surface scarred slightly by the passage of time. And yet, no matter how full the chapel became during holy days, no one sat upon it. Novices, untrained in the superstitions of their elders, would pass it without a second thought, sliding into other seats as though drawn by invisible guidance. When asked why they chose differently, many could not answer. They only shrugged, speaking of comfort, of habit, but their eyes betrayed something else, the instinct of avoidance. The sisters spoke of feelings that crept upon them during prayer. Kneeling near the pew, they described sensations of being watched, of cold draughts brushing against their veils though no window was open. Candles placed close to it sputtered more often than elsewhere, their flames bowing unnaturally low, as if forced by a breath no one could feel. Hymnals that had been left neatly on the seat were sometimes found strewn upon the floor by morning, pages bent and covers scuffed, as though the pew itself rejected sacred text. No one admitted these things openly at first. To voice such fears in a house of God was to risk censure. And so the pew became an unspoken boundary, a shadow at the heart of the chapel, tolerated but never acknowledged. One sister, known for her diligence in keeping the chapel clean, once confessed privately to another that she dreaded touching that particular seat. The wood, she whispered, always felt colder than the rest, no matter the season. In winter, the chill was expected, but in the heat of summer, when the stone floors radiated warmth and candles dripped wax too quickly, the pew still gave off a biting cold. She tried once to polish it with extra care, to treat it as she did the others. Yet her hand shook, and the rag slipped repeatedly from her grasp, as though the task itself resisted her. She finished quickly, muttering prayers under her breath, and afterward avoided the seat altogether. These small disturbances might have been dismissed as tricks of the mind had they not been accompanied by deeper, older stories. The villagers who sometimes entered the chapel on feast days carried with them rumors of the benefactor whose wealth had secured the pew's presence. He had been a figure both admired and feared, a man who gave generously to the church but whose fortune rose from obscurity with unnatural speed. Farmers said his barns had never known plague, his fields never drought, his cattle never stillborn. Too much luck, the villagers muttered, too much favor from powers no Christian man should know. His death was sudden, his burial lavish, and though the priest prayed fervently over his grave, few dared to walk past it after dusk. For the sisters, this history lingered uncomfortably, though rarely voiced. To pray each day beside an object tied to such a man was to carry his memory into their rituals, to feel his shadow stretching into their devotions. The pew seemed less a gift than a reminder, its wood imbued with the contradictions of its donor, generosity and suspicion, piety and rumor. Over time, the object became less furniture than symbol, an intrusion of the profane into the sacred. Stranger still were the reports of sound. During long vigils, when silence reigned and only the faint scratching of quills in the scriptorium or the rustle of habits could be heard, some swore they detected a faint creak from the pew. Not the natural settling of wood, but something rhythmic, as if weight pressed down and then lifted again. One sister described hearing the slow groan of timber behind her as she prayed, though when she turned, no one sat there. Another claimed that in moments of near sleep during midnight prayer, she heard a faint sigh, low and guttural, emanating from that seat alone. None of them spoke aloud of these sounds at first, but each carried the memory privately, a silent burden on faith. The abbess discouraged such talk whenever hints arose. She was a woman of firm belief, stern and unyielding, who regarded every shadow as a test of discipline rather than a manifestation of evil. To her, the devil could tempt through weakness of mind, not through benches of wood. Yet even she, in moments unguarded, was seen to hesitate before passing the pew, her eyes flickering toward it with something unspoken. Her silence, intended to strengthen the sisters, instead deepened their unease. For if the abbess herself would not sit there, how could any novice believe it safe? The chapel's architecture only fed the dread. Its narrow stained-glass windows allowed little light, so that corners often sank into gloom even at midday. At night, when candles lit the nave, shadows stretched long across the pews, pooling deepest at the one seat that no one claimed. Visitors who entered during services sometimes asked why it remained empty, but the sisters deflected, mumbling of habit, of order, never daring to reveal the truth. The silence became its own cage, trapping each woman in her private fear. By the time Sister Agnes gave her voice to the terror, the seeds had already been planted by decades of avoidance, whispers, and half-seen shapes. She did not create the fear. She only ripped open the veil that had hidden it. The pew had always been a presence, tolerated but not named, endured but not challenged. When she finally screamed, her words crystallized the unspoken, dragging it from shadow into the blinding light of confession. And though many would later accuse her of hysteria, many others secretly felt a different truth, that she had said aloud what they had all felt but feared to admit. The early shadows in the chapel were not accidents of imagination. They were the slow erosion of certainty, the delicate unraveling of faith in a place meant to be unshakable. And though the sisters tried to cling to order, their very silence betrayed them. For what is left unspoken does not vanish. It lingers, gathering strength, waiting for the moment when one trembling voice will finally give it form. The night that Sister Agnes raised her voice in the chapel did not arrive without warning, though none of the sisters could have predicted how violently it would unfold. The convent had long endured its silences, its flickering shadows, its unsettled pew. Yet all these had remained contained, half buried beneath obedience and fear. What Agnes did was break that boundary, shattering the discipline that kept their unease hidden. In her trembling body, the weight of decades found expression, erupting in words that no prayer could silence. It began during evening vespers. The sisters had gathered as always, their habits brushing softly against the stone as they filed into the chapel. The air was heavy with rain, the storm outside pressing against the windows with gusts that rattled the ancient glass. Thunder growled in the distance, a low sound that seemed to roll beneath the psalms like a second, unwanted chorus. Candles flickered, their flames straining as the wind seeped through cracks in the walls. The pew, silent and unoccupied, sat in its usual place, ignored but never forgotten. Agnes had taken her place several rows behind it, her hands clutching her rosary tightly. She was not a woman known for boldness. Her life until then had been marked by frailty, a pale complexion, a voice that rarely rose above a murmur, a demeanor of constant humility. Yet beneath her quiet exterior had long simmered a growing dread, nurtured by sleepless nights and unshakable impressions that the pew was not merely wood. She had confessed nothing of this to the abbess, but in her prayers, she begged for relief. Each night the same, kneeling in silence, feeling unseen eyes fixed upon her. By the time vespers came, her body trembled with a pressure that could no longer be contained. As the psalms were chanted, Agnes's voice faltered. She clutched her beads tighter, her breaths ragged. And then, without warning, she broke. A scream tore from her throat, piercing through the harmony of prayer, shocking every head into silence. Rosaries slipped from fingers, pages of hymnals froze mid-turn. For an instant, the only sound was her cry, echoing against the stone. Her finger stretched forward, pointing toward the pew. Her eyes, wide with terror, gleamed in the candlelight. "He sits there," she cried, her words half sob, half shout. "The devil has taken his place. That seat is his, and no sister should kneel before it." The abbess was on her feet immediately, her habit swaying as she strode toward Agnes. "Silence yourself," she commanded, her voice stern, filled with authority. But Agnes could not be silenced. Her entire frame shook as if seized by unseen hands. She fell to her knees, gripping the floorboards, her head bowed yet her voice unrelenting. "Do you not hear him?" she pleaded. "Do you not feel the air grow heavy when you pass? He watches us from that place. He laughs as we pray. The devil mocks us from his pew." The sisters gasped, their voices a mix of prayer and panic. Some pressed crosses to their lips, whispering invocations against evil. Others turned their eyes toward the pew, only to look away quickly, as though fearful that acknowledgement alone might invite danger. The abbess attempted to restore order, yet even she hesitated as her eyes flicked toward the bench. Though she would never admit it, her heart beat faster, her skin prickled with unease. Agnes's words poured forth with a force that seemed beyond her fragile body. She described nights when she knelt in prayer and heard a growl, low and guttural, vibrating from the very wood of the pew. She spoke of cold air brushing her cheek when she dared to look upon it, of whispers that mingled with the psalms, carrying meanings she could not grasp but felt none the less. She cried that the devil had made himself comfortable in their sanctuary, claiming a seat not out of reverence but out of mockery, seated as though he belonged among the faithful. The abbess shouted for two sisters to restrain her, but Agnes fought against their grasp, her thin arms thrashing with surprising strength. Her veil slipped from her head, her hair damp with sweat clinging to her pale skin. Tears streamed down her face as she begged them to believe her. "Do not ignore it," she sobbed. "You have all felt it. You know it is true. The pew is his. It has always been his. The scene fractured the convent's fragile sense of unity. Some sisters wept openly, convinced that evil had indeed infiltrated their holy space. Others whispered prayers, their voices shaking, desperate to drown out Agnes's accusations. A few clung to the abbess's authority, insisting that this was hysteria, a weakness of mind that must not be entertained. Yet no one could fully dismiss what had been spoken. For in their hearts, each carried unspoken memories, the flickering flames, the unexplained chills, the instinctive avoidance of that seat. Agnes had voiced what they feared but refused to name. The abbess, desperate to quell the chaos, declared that Agnes was suffering from exhaustion, that her cries were not revelations but delusions. She ordered her confined to her quarters, forbidden to speak until she regained composure. Two sisters dragged the trembling woman away, her voice fading down the corridor, still repeating the same words, "The devil sits there, he sits there still," but though Agnes's voice diminished with distance, its echo remained within the chapel. The pew, silent and untouched, seemed to command greater attention than ever before. Each candle's flame cast shadows across it, stretching and curling as if alive. No one dared approach. Even as the abbess demanded prayers resume, the psalms carried a tremor, their rhythm broken by fear. That night marked a turning point. The convent's silence, once a shield, had been pierced. The devil was no longer an abstract presence, banished to sermons and scripture. He had been named as a guest within their chapel, seated in wood carved by human hands, watching them pray. Even those who resisted belief in Agnes's words could not escape the image she had conjured. From that evening onward, the pew was never again an object of indifference. It was a presence, a silent participant in every prayer, a reminder that holiness could be mocked from within its own walls. In the days that followed, Agnes's condition worsened. She spoke less, but her eyes remained fixed, haunted, whenever the chapel bells rang. She begged not to be forced to enter, insisting she could still hear the low growl whenever she neared the pew. Her health declined, her voice grew weak, but her certainty never faltered. And though the abbess chastised her, though priests dismissed her claims as hysteria, the sisters could not erase the memory of that night. They had seen her terror, heard her words, and felt in their own hearts the chill that silence could no longer hide. The nun's accusation was more than a cry. It was an unveiling, a tearing open of fears long suppressed. By daring to name the devil's presence, she had transformed a simple bench into the most powerful symbol in the convent. The pew was no longer empty. It was occupied, not by flesh and blood, but by something unseen, something unholy, something that no amount of prayer could drive away. In the days that followed Sister Agnes's outburst, the convent became a place of uneasy silences and stolen glances. What had once been a rhythm of predictable devotion, bells marking the hours, prayers filling the air, silence binding the walls, was now fractured by something unspoken, something that refused to be dismissed. Agnes had been confined to her cell, her voice reduced to faint murmurs through the wooden door. Yet her words lingered, repeating in the minds of the sisters. The devil sits there, he sits there still. The abbess, determined to maintain order, publicly denounced Agnes's declaration. She gathered the nuns in the refectory, her voice firm as she spoke of weakness, of delusion, of the dangers of giving in to hysteria. She insisted that the pew was merely wood, that fear had crept into their discipline, and that faith must stand stronger than imagination. Her tone was steady, yet her eyes betrayed the strain. She avoided speaking the pew's location, never pointing toward it, as though naming it again might give power to Agnes's words. Some sisters accepted the abbess's explanation with relief, clinging to the authority of reason and the reassurance of tradition. To believe Agnes was to step into chaos, to question the sanctity of the very walls that sheltered them. Others, however, remained unconvinced. In whispered corners, in hushed exchanges while scrubbing floors or preparing meals, doubts crept in. Did not each of them feel unease when passing the pew? Had they not, in their own moments of solitude, caught themselves glancing toward it, expecting, dreading, movement? The whispers spread quietly, like smoke finding cracks in stone. Some recalled strange occurrences that now seemed impossible to ignore: the flicker of a candle extinguished without draught, the sound of wood creaking as though bearing a weight unseen, the sudden chill that settled on the skin when kneeling too near. Each story was offered cautiously, never in the abbess's presence, but enough to feed a growing undercurrent of belief. Yet just as belief swelled, so too did denial. For every sister who confessed her unease, another scolded her for weakness. "You invite darkness by giving it voice," they would say. "Silence is our shield." But silence was no longer a sanctuary, it had become complicit. Each denial only deepened the division, creating two unspoken camps within the convent, those who feared the pew and those who refused to acknowledge it. Agnes herself became a figure of dread. Some sisters pitied her, slipping morsels of bread or whispered prayers through the door of her cell. Others avoided her entirely, claiming that her presence was tainted, that to stand near her was to risk contagion of her delusion. Rumors arose that she muttered constantly, speaking to someone unseen, answering voices that no one else could hear. A few swore they had heard her laughing in the night, a hollow sound that did not belong to her gentle nature. Whether true or exaggerated, these tales deepened her isolation, transforming her from victim to omen. The priest summoned to the convent brought no relief. They listened to the abbess, nodded gravely, and dismissed Agnes as afflicted by melancholy, her mind weakened by the burden of devotion. They spoke of fasting, of penance, of restoring discipline. But none dared linger in the chapel after dusk, none placed a hand upon the pew, none knelt too close. Their confidence in reason faltered the moment the candles dimmed and the shadows stretched long. The townspeople, hearing fragments of rumor, added their own embellishments. Whispers drifted from the market stalls, that the convent harbored a demon, that a nun had been possessed, that the devil himself had claimed a seat among the holy. Farmers spat and crossed themselves at the mention. Children dared each other to look upon the convent's windows after sunset. Gossip flourished, but none outside the walls truly knew what had been said, only that something within the cloistered life of the nuns was unraveling. Inside, the atmosphere thickened. Prayers carried hesitation. Meals passed in uneasy quiet. At night, some sisters swore they heard footsteps in the chapel, heavy and deliberate, though no one walked there. Others confessed, in whispers before sleep, that dreams of the pew haunted them, dreams in which they saw a figure seated, its face obscured, its presence undeniable. Yet by dawn, those confessions were withdrawn, drowned in shame, smothered beneath denial. The abbess fought to hold the convent together, insisting on routine with greater severity. Chores were doubled, fasts extended, silence enforced with stern rebukes. She claimed discipline would cleanse them of doubt, yet her measures only stoked resentment. For the harder she pressed, the more the sisters whispered, their fears finding refuge in secrecy. And always, at the center of those fears, stood the pew, silent and unyielding. It was during one midnight vigil that the division became undeniable. A group of sisters kept watch in the chapel, their candles casting dim light across the worn stone. As the hours passed, one nun trembled visibly, her eyes fixed upon the empty pew. When asked what troubled her, she whispered that she saw the wood shifting, bending slightly as though under a weight. Another sister scolded her, insisting she saw nothing. The two argued in hushed tones until the abbess silenced them, yet the damage was done. Fear had spoken aloud again, and denial had risen to crush it. By the time dawn broke, the sisters were no longer united in prayer. They were fractured, each carrying her own version of the truth, some certain that evil sat among them, others clinging desperately to the safety of disbelief. The convent was no longer a single body moving in harmony, but a house divided, bound together by routine yet separated by conviction. What Agnes had unleashed was no longer hers alone. Her accusation had seeded a conflict that no abbess, no priest, no ritual could easily resolve. Whispers and denials clashed daily, building tension like a storm pressing against fragile walls. And in the center of it all, silent, untouched, patient, sat the pew, its presence needing no words, no proof, no movement. The sisters themselves provided all the life it required, each denial feeding its shadow, each whisper strengthening its hold. Fear does not arrive as thunder, it seeps in like water through a crack, unseen at first, then undeniable when the walls begin to soften. Within the convent, the silence that once represented devotion now grew thick with dread. It was not a single sound, not a single event, but a collection of whispers, dreams, and half-seen shapes that turned obedience into survival and routine into ritualized terror. The sisters began to move differently. No longer did they glide across the chapel with steady grace, their steps faltered, their heads lowered, their eyes darted toward the pew though they fought to avoid its sight. The pew had become the axis of their unease. To pass near it was to invite a chill, as though air itself bent around it. Some claimed it smelled faintly of earth, damp and cold, as though something buried had been unearthed within the holy chamber. Others whispered of scratches, tiny gouges along the wood that had not been there before, markings that curved like claws etched in passing. Agnes's confinement did not quiet her. Her mutterings grew louder, more coherent, as though she were addressing a listener just beyond the threshold. "He waits," she whispered, over and over. Sometimes she laughed, sometimes she wept. At night, her voice carried through the stone, and even the abbess, who forbade acknowledgement, could not block the sound from her ears. The sisters began to dread not only the pew but also the echo of Agnes's voice, for it seemed to feed the presence they refused to name. One sister, Marguerite, confessed during a hushed conversation in the garden that she had dreamed of the pew 3 nights in succession. In the dream, she entered the chapel alone. The candles were all extinguished, yet she could see clearly, as though the darkness itself glowed faintly. On the pew sat a man whose face was obscured by shadow, though she sensed his eyes upon her, piercing, unblinking. He beckoned her to sit beside him, and when she refused, the floor beneath her split, swallowing her whole. She awoke screaming. Marguerite swore the scent of sulfur clung to her hair for hours afterward. Dreams became common currency among the sisters. Each carried visions, and though they rarely confessed them openly, the fragments slipped out in whispers, in pale faces at morning prayer, in trembling hands during work. The pew had colonized their sleep, turning sacred rest into nightly torment. Yet even as dreams multiplied, denial persisted. Some claimed these were mere products of overwork, of fasting, of suggestibility. But their eyes betrayed fear even as their lips formed words of dismissal. The abbess's authority wavered. Her strictness grew harsher, her voice sharper, her punishments heavier. Where once she had been respected, now she was feared. But fear of the abbess was not enough to eclipse the other fear, the unspoken one. Each order she gave seemed hollow, for she too avoided the pew. She too glanced toward it when she thought no one watched. The sisters noticed, and noticing broke the fragile dam of confidence. If the abbess herself faltered, what shield remained? It was during a storm that the first true escalation revealed itself. Rain hammered the convent roof, and thunder rolled across the hills. The sisters gathered in the chapel, the air damp, their candles trembling. As they prayed, a sound joined the storm, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. The sound of wood groaning under shifting weight. Every head turned toward the pew. It did not move. It remained still, but the sound had come from it. One sister gasped, another sobbed, and the abbess shouted for silence. Yet silence no longer offered safety. Something had stirred. From that night forward, the pew was no longer merely feared, it was watched. Sisters stole glances during prayer, measuring the shadows, listening for creaks. Some swore they saw indentations on the seat, as though someone had indeed sat there and risen. One whispered of a dark stain upon the wood, like oil spreading slowly. Another claimed she felt warmth when she brushed her hand too near, as though the pew breathed faintly, alive with a pulse not its own. The convent's unity fractured further. Some clung to reason, begging their sisters not to feed hysteria, not to give Satan the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Others embraced belief, convinced that Agnes had spoken truth, that the devil himself had claimed territory within their holiest place. Each faction accused the other of betrayal, betrayal of discipline, betrayal of faith. The pew had become not only an object of fear but also a battleground of interpretation, dividing the sisters as surely as any blade. Sleep deprivation followed. Few could rest without nightmares, and even those who denied fear awoke with eyes hollow, their skin pale, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The rhythm of convent life broke down. Chores were neglected, prayers slurred, meals half-eaten. The abbess raged, but her anger was brittle, a shell around her own terror. The devil, whether real or imagined, had found his way into every breath, every glance, every heartbeat within the walls. One evening, during Vespers, Sister Marguerite collapsed, her body writhing. She cried out words no one understood, her voice guttural, foreign, as though forced from her throat by a presence not her own. Several sisters rushed to hold her down, while others fled the chapel. The abbess declared it a seizure, nothing more. But among the sisters, whispers grew certain, the pew had chosen another. Agnes was not alone. The town beyond the convent heard new rumors. Some claimed lightning had struck the chapel, leaving scorch marks upon the pew. Others insisted a black dog had been seen prowling the convent grounds, its eyes glowing, its form vanishing before it touched the gate. Farmers avoided the paths leading near the convent, mothers warned children not to stare at its windows after dusk. The convent's isolation deepened, its reputation shifting from holy refuge to haunted prison. Agnes, still locked away, laughed more often. Her laughter carried through the halls, hollow and triumphant, as though she knew what others refused to confess. "He is patient," she said. "He is comfortable." Her words spread like poison. The sisters dreaded hearing her, yet dreaded more the silence that followed, for silence meant he listened instead. By now, denial had become impossible to sustain. Even those who had once insisted on reason began to falter. They walked faster past the pew, their prayers shorter, their confessions more desperate. The convent, once devoted to God alone, had become consumed by something else entirely. The devil, seated or imagined, had claimed not only a pew but also their hearts, bending devotion into dread. What began as whispers had swelled into a storm of fear. Every day, the sisters asked themselves the same question: would they endure, or would they break? The pew offered no answer, only presence. And that presence grew heavier with each passing hour. When fear begins to suffocate a community, the instinct to seek reason rises like a final gasp for air. The convent, once a place of unshakable order, had been reduced to trembling shadows and whispered dread. To some sisters, only faith could shield them. To others, faith had already faltered. In this vacuum of certainty, explanations became the currency of survival. They needed to know whether the devil had indeed taken a seat among them, or if human frailty, madness, and imagination had conspired to trick them all. The abbess, despite her own quivering faith, recognized the danger of silence. Rumors had already reached the nearby town, and the longer the convent allowed mystery to fester, the more it risked collapse from within. Thus, she summoned voices from beyond the walls, scholars, priests, and even physicians. Each carried their own arsenal of words, their own convictions, their own desire to claim mastery over the phenomenon. Yet none would leave without sowing deeper discord. The first to arrive was Father Henri, an aging priest known for his rigid orthodoxy. His back was bent with years of ritual, his eyes sharp with suspicion. To him, the matter was simple: the devil had chosen to mock their devotion by placing his mark where holiness was deepest. He scorned the sisters' hesitation, demanding confession, penance, fasting, and exorcism. "The pew is not wood alone," he declared, his voice echoing in the chapel. "It is a throne of blasphemy. To deny it is to deny the enemy's cunning." His words fell like stones. Some sisters clung to them with relief, finally given a clear explanation. Others recoiled, fearing that to name the devil was to give him power. The abbess listened, her face unreadable, though her hands tightened against her robes. Father Henri requested to sleep within the chapel overnight, certain that he could confront the intruder with prayer. Yet when dawn came, his eyes were hollow, his lips cracked, his hands shaking. He did not speak of what he had seen, or not seen. He simply departed, leaving behind only the weight of unanswered questions. Soon after, a physician was called from the nearby town. Dr. Fournier was a man of the Enlightenment, skeptical of superstition, fond of rational explanations. He examined Agnes, still locked in her cell, still whispering in alternating tones of sorrow and laughter. To him, she was not possessed but unwell, a victim of hysteria, perhaps worsened by religious fervor and the isolation of convent life. He noted her malnourished frame, her restless eyes, her uneven breathing. She believes herself chosen, he said, and belief is the most dangerous contagion. The pew is no devil's throne. It is a stage upon which human imagination performs. His diagnosis soothed some but enraged others. Could imagination etch scratches into the wood? Could hysteria stain the air with sulfur? Could shared delusion cause candles to gutter in unison when no draught stirred? The sisters debated fiercely. Some accused Agnes of deception, her madness a performance designed to claim attention. Others argued that no mortal woman could conjure such fear across so many hearts. The physician left certain he had solved the matter, yet his explanation left the convent more fractured than before. Then came a scholar, a visiting historian from Lyon, whose fascination with local folklore drew him into the convent's plight. He brought with him volumes of stories, pages inked with tales of cursed objects, haunted relics, and devils who entered not through grand gestures but through ordinary items, a chair, a cup, a mirror. Legends abound of the devil claiming a seat, he told them. Once a space is given, it becomes his tether. Whether true or not, belief alone grants power. The pew may hold no demon at all, only centuries of fear woven into its grain. The historian's words struck differently. They were neither wholly rational nor wholly faithful. They lived in the murk between, where folklore is both lie and truth. Some sisters found comfort in this perspective, believing that perhaps they had not been cursed by hell but ensnared by story. Yet others bristled at the idea that their terror was born from tales, not reality. The abbess dismissed him coldly, unwilling to accept that her convent's unraveling could be explained away as superstition given breath. As explanations multiplied, so too did the tension. Each sister chose her camp, her voice sharpening against the others. Faithful against skeptical, rational against fearful, tradition against folklore. The convent became a parliament of shadows, its unity shredded. Even prayer, once their anchor, turned brittle. Some prayed for deliverance, others for clarity, others merely for silence. But silence never came. Agnes continued to mutter, the pew continued to groan, and nights continued to bring dreams that felt less like imagination and more like summons. One evening, a desperate experiment unfolded. A small group of sisters, weary of waiting, decided to test the pew. They did not announce their plan, fearing the abbess's wrath. At midnight, they entered the chapel with only a single candle. Their plan was simple: one would sit upon the pew, to prove or disprove its curse. The others would witness, ready to drag her away should anything occur. It was Sister Isabel who volunteered. She lowered herself onto the pew slowly, her knees trembling, her breath uneven. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched. Then, the candle flickered violently, though no wind stirred. Isabel gasped, clutching the wood as if it had burned her. She claimed she felt heat radiating upward, searing through her robes, as though the pew pulsed with fire from within. She leapt to her feet, screaming, her hands blistered though the wood bore no mark. The others fled, their candle extinguished in the rush. By morning, Isabel's hands bore red welts, undeniable, unexplained. This incident spread panic anew. Rational voices faltered. If the pew was only wood, how could it burn without flame? Explanations twisted upon themselves, fragile and desperate. Perhaps Isabel had burned herself in secret. Perhaps her own fear had raised the blisters. Perhaps her body, racked by tension, had betrayed her with some strange ailment. Each attempt to reason seemed more forced, less convincing. The pew had not only resisted explanation, it had humiliated it. The abbess, now visibly shaken, resorted to silence. No longer did she chastise whispers or forbid mention of the devil. Instead, she moved quickly through the chapel, avoiding the pew as all others did. Her authority crumbled in the face of unrelenting mystery. The convent had reached a stage where every explanation, whether holy, rational, or folkloric, collapsed under the same weight. None could stop the pew from being what it was. And so the struggle for explanation became not a solution but a mirror. Each voice that tried to tame the mystery revealed only the fear of the one who spoke. The priest revealed his terror of evil's triumph. The physician revealed his terror of irrationality. The historian revealed his terror of forgotten legends gripping the present. And the sisters, caught between them all, revealed their terror of themselves, of minds betraying faith, of faith betraying reason. By the time the final outsider departed, the convent was left in a strange stillness. No one agreed on what the pew was, but all agreed on what it had done. It had divided them, hollowed them, turned explanation into fuel for further dread. It had shown them that knowledge, whether drawn from scripture, science, or folklore, did not banish fear but magnified it. And so the pew sat untouched, unclaimed, more powerful for its defiance of understanding. For fear thrives not when explained, but when explanation fails. When reason fails and faith fractures, what remains is neither belief nor denial but a hollow space where despair thrives. By the late autumn of that year, the convent was no longer a house of harmony but a labyrinth of silences. Doors were closed more often than they were open. Candles flickered not in communal prayer but in solitary corners, each nun clutching her beads as though the rosary itself were a chain against collapse. The devil's pew had not only claimed a space within the chapel, it had colonized their minds, making each woman her own prison. The abbess, once firm in her voice, now drifted through the corridors like a figure carved from wax. Her authority had been eroded first by doubt, then by fear, and finally by resignation. She spoke less, ate little, and was seen most often in the chapel's rear, where her eyes never lifted toward the cursed pew. Some whispered that she, too, was afflicted, that she heard footsteps at night when none walked, that she dreamed of laughter not her own. Whether truth or rumor, her silence gave it weight, and the sisters began to feel abandoned not only by God but by the woman who had once been his steward among them. Agnes, still confined, had grown gaunt and spectral. Her eyes, though sunken, carried a peculiar brightness, as if illuminated from within by a cruel flame. At night her mutterings spilled beyond her cell, seeping into the halls like smoke. Some sisters swore they heard two voices alternating from her throat, one pleading, one mocking. Others claimed that the very stones of the convent absorbed her words, carrying them into rooms far away. Whether this was true or not scarcely mattered. What mattered was that Agnes had ceased to be one of them. She was no longer simply Sister Agnes but something else entirely, an emblem of corruption, a reminder of their vulnerability, a shadow in human form. The division within the convent deepened until it became two distinct camps. On one side stood those who clung fiercely to ritual, fasting until their bodies shook, kneeling until their knees bruised, scouring every breath with prayer. They believed only submission could starve the devil of his triumph. On the other side were those who recoiled from the chapel, refusing to enter except under strict compulsion. To them, the pew was not to be confronted but avoided, a pitfall to be circled until time itself buried it under dust. Between the two groups stretched a gulf of suspicion. Those who prayed accused the others of weakness. Those who hid accused the devout of feeding the very evil they wished to banish. Neither side listened, both feared the other more than they feared the pew itself. The town, too, began to withdraw. News had trickled outward despite the abbess's efforts, and villagers muttered of curses carried by the convent walls. The baker delivered bread but no longer lingered. Children were forbidden to play near the gates. Travelers avoided the road that passed beside the convent, as though a shadow had stretched across it. For centuries, the convent had stood as a pillar of safety, a refuge of sanctity amid the wilderness. Now it was whispered of as a place to be skirted, a nest where something unholy had made its home. The isolation grew not only spiritual but tangible, they were cut off from the world that had once nourished them. Inside, ordinary tasks faltered. Meals were sparse, gardens neglected, hymns abandoned. The rhythm of convent life, so structured, so orderly, collapsed into fragments. Some sisters stayed in their cells for days, refusing to speak. Others paced endlessly, their footsteps echoing in the night. The bell tower rang irregularly, sometimes not at all, as though time itself no longer obeyed their schedule. The convent was unraveling, thread by thread, until it resembled not a house of God but a haunted shell where the air itself had grown weary. It was during these days of unraveling that the pew began to exhibit new torments. The wood, once silent, now creaked at random, as if shifting under invisible weight. Once, during a dawn prayer, the sisters heard 3 sharp knocks issue from its surface, measured, deliberate, echoing in the stillness. All fell to their knees, trembling, yet none dared approach. Another night, when the chapel was empty, Sister Madeline claimed she passed by the doors and heard laughter within. She entered, candle trembling, and found the pew alone. But her candle sputtered and died, leaving her in complete darkness. When she emerged, her face was pale, her lips sealed, and she never spoke of what she had felt in that moment. Such incidents eroded what little courage remained. The sisters avoided the chapel entirely at night, leaving its vastness to the shadows. They prayed in their cells, but even prayer felt brittle, words collapsing before they left their mouths. Fear had turned inward, gnawing at them until they could no longer distinguish between what they had seen and what they only dreaded to see. One winter evening, snow pressing against the convent walls, Sister Isabel, the same who had once dared sit upon the pew, suffered a collapse. She had grown more withdrawn since her blistered hands, and though her wounds had healed, her mind had not. That night she wandered into the courtyard barefoot, whispering of fire beneath her skin. When the others found her, she was kneeling in the snow, her hands pressed against the frozen ground, begging it to cool her. They carried her inside, but by morning she had fallen into fever. Within days she was gone, her death shrouded in silence. Officially, it was recorded as illness. Privately, it was whispered as another toll taken by the pew. Isabel's passing cemented the sense that the convent was under siege not by soldiers or plague but by something far more insidious, despair itself. The sisters no longer sought answers. They no longer debated. They no longer invited outsiders. Instead, they folded inward, cutting ties to everything beyond their gates. Letters went unanswered. Visitors were turned away. Even funerals were held without townsfolk. The convent became a sealed vessel, adrift in its own storm, its walls both protection and prison. The abbess, frail and diminished, declared that the pew must remain untouched. Some begged her to have it destroyed, burned, or cast out. But she refused, insisting that to move it would be to invite worse. "We are chosen to endure," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. And so the pew remained, a silent tyrant, ruling over an empty chapel no longer filled with songs but with absence. Weeks turned into months, and the convent's silence deepened into a kind of death. No laughter, no hymns, no communal warmth. Only the sound of wind against stone, the occasional sob in the corridors, and the ever-present knowledge of the pew waiting in the chapel, as steadfast as the altar itself. It had succeeded not by violence, nor by spectacle, but by corrosion, by turning a sanctuary into a tomb, by isolating each sister until they were alone together. Collapse had arrived, not with fire and brimstone, but with the slow suffocation of hope. Isolation sealed it, leaving the convent to drift further into obscurity, its story whispered only in fragments, its gates seen from afar but rarely approached. Within, the sisters lived on, but it was a living marked by absence, absence of joy, absence of certainty, absence of the God they had once believed would shield them. In that void, the pew remained triumphant, untouched, unbroken, a throne not of wood but of despair. When a place collapses inward upon itself, the world outside often responds not with curiosity but with distance. The convent that had once been a beacon of devotion, ringing its bells across the valley with confidence, now stood like a husk. And the village at its borders, though it continued with harvests and markets and births, learned to live in the shadow of something it no longer spoke of. The silence began not as superstition but as survival, for to name what had happened was to invite its echo. Better to forget, or at least pretend to. Better to turn the eyes away from the stone walls and call them merely ruins, even while their cloisters still held breath. The villagers who had once looked upon the sisters as holy guardians now whispered of contagion. Some said madness was catching, that the devil's pew was not bound by wood or mortar but by the imagination itself. If one heard too much of it, they claimed, one's dreams would fill with mocking voices and sleepless laughter. Mothers pressed their hands over their children's ears when travelers mentioned the convent. Fathers drew the sign of the cross when the chapel bell rang, though it rang more rarely now, and sometimes with a cracked tone that carried unease across the hills. The sound of the bell itself became a reminder that the convent had not died entirely, though many wished it had. Merchants avoided the convent road when they could. Pilgrims who once stopped to rest in the village before ascending to the chapel chose other routes. The town's priest, long allied with the abbess, preached less about the convent and more about the duties of ordinary faith, as though drawing a veil over a wound that could not be healed. His sermons emphasized personal virtue, not the sanctity of sacred places. The message was clear: holiness must be sought in the heart, not in walls where shadows lingered. Among the villagers, stories sprouted like weeds, each one contradicting the other yet rooted in the same soil of fear. One tale held that Sister Agnes had died long ago, her remains walled into the pew itself, her spirit trapped in the fibers of its wood. Another insisted she still lived, barely human, nourished not by bread but by something darker, her voice leaking from the chapel at night. Children dared each other to creep close enough to see candlelight in the windows, and when they swore they saw flickers, their elders cuffed them harshly, demanding silence. It was not to be discussed, not even in play. The convent itself grew increasingly invisible to history. Records ceased. Letters were not sent. Officials who once corresponded with the abbess filed other matters instead. It was as if the place had been struck from the ledger of the living, allowed to drift in obscurity until time itself might bury it. And yet, it remained, a structure too sturdy to fall, too infamous to visit. In the minds of the townspeople, the convent became not a place but a symbol, a caution whispered in the margins of ordinary life. Farmers warned their children never to let idle thoughts stray toward forbidden things. Wives muttered that curiosity was the devil's hook. Old men sitting outside the tavern spoke of the convent not as history but as a wound still bleeding. Their words were fragmented, guarded, half-believed even by themselves. But the tone was always the same: distance, warning, refusal. Within the convent walls, the sisters lived on, though their numbers thinned. Some succumbed to illness, others to despair. Rumors suggested a few slipped away in the night, abandoning vows for survival. The abbess, aging rapidly, was said to have forbidden burial in the town graveyard, insisting the sisters rest within their own grounds. By this decree, the convent became not only a place of isolation but of death, its soil heavy with unmarked graves. Each mound was another reason for the villagers to avoid its gates, for death, too, was believed to be contagious. The silence was not absolute. Sometimes, in the markets, women whispered of hearing sounds carried by the wind, faint chants, sobs, or a wooden creak that echoed like the shifting of a chair. These tales were always dismissed aloud, yet repeated in secret. At night, doors were bolted earlier, candles burned longer, and prayers were recited with more fervor. The convent, though absent from daily speech, had burrowed into the rhythm of the town like a parasite. Even silence was a form of acknowledgement. As years passed, the tale of the devil's pew grew less like history and more like folklore. Outsiders, unaware of the details, asked questions, and the villagers responded with vague shrugs or diverted the subject. Yet, in private, the story hardened. Parents told it to their children as a lesson against disobedience. Lovers invoked it in whispers to frighten one another. The pew became less about a piece of furniture and more about the idea of temptation, of what happens when one sits where one should not, when one entertains thoughts better left unspoken. Some scholars, much later, would write of this silence as a cultural scar. They noted that the absence of records, the refusal to preserve detail, was itself a form of preservation, a preservation of distance, a preservation of the boundary between the living and the haunted. The townspeople were not historians, they were survivors. And survivors know that some things are best left unsaid. Yet the convent itself stood as a contradiction to this silence. Its towers and walls loomed, unchanging, visible from the hills, unavoidable in their presence. To live in the village was to live in its shadow. The silence, then, was never pure, it was an act of denial repeated daily, a ritual of forgetting that never quite succeeded. For each morning the sun struck the chapel roof, each night the wind moaned through its cloisters, and each villager carried, whether they admitted it or not, the knowledge that something waited within. By the end of that century, the convent had withered nearly to emptiness. Few sisters remained. The abbess was gone, her death unnoticed beyond the walls. Without leadership, the women faded into obscurity, their lives dissolving like wax. The chapel's bell eventually cracked and fell silent. Grass grew in the courtyards. Windows darkened. What was once a house of worship became a shell, its silence deepened not only by secrecy but by abandonment. And yet, in the minds of those who remembered, it never became simply ruin. It remained alive in whispers, in dreams, in the shudder that passed over villagers when an outsider asked why the old road was so deserted. The convent was not history, it was presence. Its silence was not empty but full, dense with things unspoken. And at the heart of that silence, always, lay the pew, a single object that had outlived voices, rituals, and generations. The devil's pew did not vanish with the sisters. It remained, a throne waiting in an empty chapel, its wood darkened by time, untouched by dust, as though preserved by something that would not permit decay. For the town, the aftermath was a silence shaped into habit, and habit shaped into fear. For the convent, the aftermath was survival without meaning, existence without purpose, breath without song. For history, the aftermath was erasure, yet even erasure cannot kill memory. Somewhere in that silence, in that void, the story of the nun who claimed the devil had his own pew lingered on, unresolved, refusing to die. Every haunting leaves behind not only silence but speculation. The convent, abandoned and forgotten by the wider world, became less a physical place than a question mark carved into stone. And like all questions of this kind, it drew seekers, skeptics, and storytellers, each eager to explain what had once unsettled a whole community. Their theories ranged from the mundane to the terrifying, from reason's careful hand to faith's darker confessions. None resolved the story, yet each added another layer, like dust upon an old reliquary, clouding the truth while preserving it at the same time. The first and most obvious theory was madness. Some argued that Sister Agnes, the nun who had insisted that the devil had a seat among the faithful, suffered from an illness of the mind. In an age before diagnoses, before the understanding of delusion or psychosis, her visions were mistaken for something supernatural. Those who cling to this explanation point to the convent's strict routines, the isolation of its walls, the constant pressure of devotion, and the possibility of deprivation. Sleep-starved, overworked, and surrounded by the weight of ritual, Sister Agnes might have conjured the image of the devil's pew in her mind, projecting her inner torment onto the outer world. Yet, critics of this theory ask, if it was madness alone, why did others claim to see or hear the same? Why did whispers ripple not only among the sisters but into the village beyond? Madness may explain one voice, but it struggles to account for the choir of fear that followed. A second theory looked to suggestion and contagion, not of disease, but of belief. Fear spreads quickly, like flame in dry grass, and perhaps Sister Agnes's insistence planted a seed. Each retelling, each whispered warning, became water to that seed, until the pew itself seemed alive with malevolence. In this telling, the devil never needed to sit, it was enough that the people believed he did. The mind, once bent toward expectation, will conjure what it dreads. A creak becomes a growl. A shadow becomes a figure. Silence becomes voice. This explanation appeals to the rational, but it still requires one to accept the remarkable power of collective imagination, strong enough to shape years of silence and avoidance. There were those who rejected reason altogether, claiming the devil's presence was real. They argued that the pew was no ordinary wood, but anointed, then corrupted, perhaps the result of a blasphemous ritual, or a curse laid upon the convent. Folklore from the surrounding countryside lent fuel to this claim, for stories older than the convent spoke of a wandering spirit that demanded a seat at human gatherings. Farmers had once left an empty chair at their feasts, saying it was better to leave the devil his place than to risk him choosing his own. To these believers, Sister Agnes had not been deluded, she had been perceptive, recognizing what others ignored. The pew, in this view, was the devil's rightful claim. The silence that followed was not madness but wisdom, a recognition that he still sat there, waiting. Still others sought a compromise between faith and reason. They proposed that the pew symbolized something more abstract, a collective guilt within the convent, or a hidden crime. Was there a sin buried within those walls, a scandal never recorded, that the sisters could not face? Did Sister Agnes give voice to an unspoken truth by declaring that the devil himself had a place among them? In this theory, the pew was not haunted but emblematic, a physical reminder of hypocrisy or hidden wrongdoing. The refusal to sit upon it may have been less about fear of a demon and more about fear of acknowledgement. Yet such a theory remains speculative, for no records of scandal have survived, only silence. As the centuries turned, scholars and folklorists took interest in the story. They attempted to trace documents, cross-reference accounts, interview aging villagers who still trembled when recalling their childhood warnings. The findings were fragmentary, elusive. A letter here, a sermon there, vague references in parish ledgers. What became clear was not the truth of the pew but the persistence of its presence in memory. Each generation reinterpreted it according to its fears. To one era, it was madness. To another, superstition. To another, perhaps even metaphor for the invasive power of evil in the heart of faith. Yet none could say with certainty. The convent remained mute, and the pew remained untouched, its story written not in facts but in the atmosphere it left behind. There were darker theories still. Some whispered that the silence itself was the evidence, that the refusal to document, the vanishing of letters, was proof of deliberate concealment. What had been hidden? Perhaps Sister Agnes had not been alone. Perhaps others had joined her in claiming the devil sat in the chapel, and perhaps those claims led to scandal the church wished buried. To erase the convent from record may have been less about mercy for the sisters and more about the protection of reputation. In such a case, the pew was not cursed, but dangerous nonetheless, not to the soul, but to authority. If true, then the silence that followed was not fear of the devil but obedience to men. Travelers who visit the ruins today, if they dare, report contradictory experiences. Some say the chapel feels hollow, empty, nothing more than stone. Others claim a weight presses upon them as they near the altar, as though unseen eyes watch from the shadows. A few insist the pew still sits in its place, weathered but unbroken, resisting time's decay. The wood, they say, looks less aged than it should, its polish preserved against reason. Whether this is embellishment or observation is impossible to know, for photographs are rare, and the site remains closed, its gates locked by chains long rusted. In the end, the question remains unresolved because it refuses resolution. The devil's pew endures not because of proof but because of uncertainty. It thrives in silence, in absence, in the refusal of the convent and village alike to name it fully. Perhaps that is the truest haunting, not the presence of evil, but the impossibility of clarity. The story sits in history like the pew itself sits in the chapel, an object both ordinary and unbearable, too simple to explain yet too heavy to dismiss. And so the story passes on, whispered, half-believed, shaped by the fears of each listener. The nun who claimed the devil had his own pew left behind more than a scandal, she left behind a mirror in which each generation sees its own darkness. Whether it was madness, suggestion, corruption, or truth, the pew remains as a question no one dares to answer. Unresolved, it lingers. And perhaps that is its purpose. For some mysteries live not to be solved, but to be remembered, haunting the silence long after the last bell has rung.